How's your sight this morning? Everyone see me okay? Okay. Because we need to see, don't we? It's difficult, even devastating when we can't. But are we seeing what we need to today? Are we seeing what we need to? A number of years ago, I met a guy who wore an eye patch. And not a gauze from an injury, but like an actual full-time eye patch, like a pirate would wear. And when you meet a pirate or a guy with an eye patch, there's questions, right? And eventually, through our conversation, he told me and the people I was with what happened to him. As a young boy, he went out into the backyard with some friends to play, just boys being boys. And on the way out of the house, they grabbed some darts. And they were throwing darts at things, target practice, probably boys with their imagination, pretending they're in some sort of a battle, right? And they're throwing darts at things, and they're taking target practice when he got this bright idea. Now, let's not forget, a boy's brain doesn't develop fully until they're what, like 45, 50? No. Let's see how high I can throw this dart in the air. And he threw the dart as high as he could in the air, and then he took his head back to look for it. And he saw it. Not for long. It landed right in his eye. I don't know, that's what you call bullseye. I don't know. Yeah, I know. A painful moment. But the most difficult, devastating thing is that he can't see. And we need to see. And it's important to see with our physical eyes. And we know the challenges that we get when we can't do that. I mean, even when you get a bug in your eye or an eyelash, we know the challenges that come. But even more important than that is our ability to see God through the eyes of faith. It is difficult. It is devastating when we can't do that. How clear is that vision for you today? If I were to be honest, sometimes it's foggy, isn't it? I think if we were to be honest with ourselves, sometimes that vision is foggy. And if I were to be honest with myself, that vision gets foggy when I'm in a battle. And often a battle with not just myself, but with other people. And if I were to be honest with myself, the battle often gets worse, not because of what they're doing, but because of things I've done all by myself. So how clear is your vision today? Are you able to see God through eyes of faith? Well, today we're going to look at a story in 2 Kings chapter 6. And in this story, as we work through this text, we're going to see how we can. All right? We're going to see how we can spiritually, with spiritual eyes. And we're also going to look at what it looks like when we're blind. And we're going to see a comparison between spiritual blindness and spiritual sight. And like I said, spiritual sight often gets foggy through times of battle, when there's interpersonal conflict or battles going on in our life. And that's exactly what's the context of the story. The king of Aram, Ben-Hadad II, is bringing a battle to the people of Israel. And in this battle between people, now the fight to see God is on. So let's turn to that story, if you will. 2 Kings chapter 6. And we're going to work through verses 8 through 23 today. The first few verses, beginning in chapter 6, verse 8. Now the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After conferring with his officers, he said, I will set up my camp in such and such a place. The man of God sent word to the king of Israel, beware of passing that place, because the Arameans are going down there. So the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and again, Elisha warned the king so that he was on his guard in such places. This enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, tell me, which one of us is on the side of the king of Israel? None of us, my lord the king," said one of his officers. But Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel the very words you speak in your bedroom. "Go find out where he is," the king ordered, "so I can send men and capture him." The report came back, "He is in Dothan." In this first section, spiritual blindness is found in the king of Aram. And what's that blindness? The blindness is that he believes the battle is with people. Elisha, okay, he's the problem. And it might be easy, and it might even make sense to point our finger at Elisha, or for him to point the finger at Elisha, because he can do that. Elisha actually can be pointed to and poked at. That's even verified by his servant, who says, yes, Elisha, he is the problem. Because every time you have a battle plan, he is telling the king of Israel what is happening. Elisha, he is the problem. At first glance, they believe man, a person, is the issue. And we tend to do that too. Maybe when there's a battle in our life between somebody else and us, we often assume, without a second glance, that the face you see is the source of all your grief. Like the king of Aram, we see the situation through worldly eyes. And we're blind. Look at the king. He assumes, first of all, in verse 11, that there's a traitor among them. Look at what he says. "Tell me which of us is on the side of the king of Israel." It's got to be a person here. A person has to be the problem. And then when the report comes back that, no, it's not one of us, it's Elisha, then yeah, it's got to be Elisha then. It's got to be someone that we can point to and poke. And so he assumes he's just going to take care of it. And the fastest knockout in history was in 1947 at a Golden Gloves boxing event. And a guy by the name of Mike Collins knocked somebody out in 4 seconds. And sometimes we think if we can just get that person here, we'll finish it. If we can take care of the person, it's all going to go away, because a person's got to be the problem. Well, believing that the battle was with a person or with people gave the king false confidence. Look at what he says in verse 13. "Go find out where he is," the king ordered, "so I can send men and capture him." Really? Really? Hey, are you really this blind? I mean, this is Elisha. This is the God man who healed your hero Naaman. Okay, this is who we're talking about. And this is the guy who is warning the whole nation of where you are at a particular moment so that none of them are going to be ever caught. And you think that you're just going to go and grab him? Believing the battles with people gave him false confidence. And he's as blind as his god Rimmon. That's spiritual blindness. But spiritual sight opens our eyes to something different. It opens our eyes to the God who cares to warn. See, God knows everything that's happening. In Hebrews 4:13 it says, "Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight." So God knows what's happening here. And it's God that's relaying the information to Elisha. And why is God doing that? Because God cares for his people. Even the northern kingdom that's being referred to here, who has a pretty bad track record at obedience and loyalty to God, a pretty bad track record at actually seeing him in their lives. But they're seeing him here. Because they can see that he cares for them by his warnings. In verse 10, it says, it's happening. The warnings are coming time and time again. And so what's the plan? The plan is now, end of verse 10, so that he was on his guard in such places. See, when we have the spiritual sight to know God cares to warn us, we put our guard up. That's why he warns us. Okay, so we can get our guard up. In 1 Corinthians 16:13, it says, be on your guard. Be on your guard. Stand in your faith. In 1 Thessalonians 5:6, it says, let's not be like those who are asleep, but let's be awake. And that word awake means guard. Let's put our guard up. Okay. Why? Why these commands? To get our guards up, to stand our ground. Well, in the New Testament, the context is because Jesus is coming back. And we don't want to miss him. We don't want to be blind. We want to see him. And so Jesus himself says in Matthew 24, verse 42, keep watch. Again, that's the same word, be on your guard, because you don't know the day that your Lord will return. Spiritual blindness believes the battles with people, giving us a false confidence. But spiritual sight opens our eyes to the God who cares to warn. We need to fight to see the God who fights for us. And so to do that, put your guard up. Put your guard up. The story continues in verse 14. Let's keep reading through it. Verse 14. Then he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. This is the king of Aram now. They went by night and surrounded the city. That's Dothan, where they thought Elisha was. When the servant of the man of God got up and went out early the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. Oh no, my lord, what shall we do? The servant asked. Don't be afraid, the prophet answered. Spiritual blindness in this section is seen in God's own man, the servant of Elisha. And what's the blindness? He believes the battle is hopeless. Spiritual blindness believes the battle is hopeless. This guy's terrified. He's terrified. I mean, he wakes up in the morning and he's completely surrounded by this wall of terror. And he's feeling every ounce of that terror. It reminds me of a scene from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Any fans here, Lord of the Rings? All right, we got 2. This reference might go right like that. But there's one scene in one of the movies, where the riders of Theoden, the good guys, are coming back to the land of Gondor. And as they're returning from this travel, in horror, they see that the capital city of Gondor is completely surrounded by thousands and thousands and thousands of these beasts called orcs, these evil orcs. And you can see just the blood run from their faces. And they face this terror with paleness because they think the situation is hopeless. And then at that moment, one of the commanders riding on a horse, he rides in front of the line of his warriors. And he makes this really short speech to kind of get them ready for this. And he says, "Forth and fear no darkness. Arise, arise, riders of Theoden. Spears will be shaken, swords will be splintered. A sword day, a red day ere the sun rises. Ride now, ride now, ride." Elisha, not that quite as dramatic as this guy. All that Elisha says is this. He doesn't even yell. He looks at his servant and says, "Don't be afraid." That's it. That's it. No raising his voice, no waving his hands, nothing. Just like, don't be afraid. And I think it's a little bit too passive for the servant. I mean, put yourself in his shoes. His fight or flight mechanism is completely going off. And the switch has flipped to flight. As believing the battle is hopeless gives us unnecessary fear. When we believe the battle is hopeless with blind spiritual eyes, we get unnecessary fear. Isaiah 41:10 says, "Do not fear, I am with you. Do not be dismayed, I am your God." But Elisha's servant, at this moment, the flight switch is on. The faith switch is off. And at that moment, he's blinded to the God who will keep his promises and who promised to love his people. In 1 John 4:18, it says there is no fear in love, because perfect love casts out fear. It's easy for us to be like, oh yeah, come on, servant. But let's face it, we might do the same thing. Let's not be too hard on him. Because this guy knows that God, through spiritual eyes, okay, he's cared to warn them. Okay, he knows that part. But we get here to this part of the story, and guess what? There's no warning. Now what? He just wakes up to this wall of terror. Verse 16, "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Spiritual sight opens our eyes to the God who surrounds to protect. This is something that Elisha's seen before. Just turn back a couple pages, if you're there with me in 2 Kings 6, to chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. We saw the story probably about a month, 6 weeks ago. This is when Elisha's mentor, Elijah, is taken up into heaven in a whirlwind. And it says this: "As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elisha went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, 'My father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel.' And Elisha saw him no more." Elisha's eyes have been opened to this reality before. And he still sees it. He's still able to see it. He's still able to see this truth and this comfort. He's not the only one. King David saw the same thing. Look at Psalm chapter 27. In Psalm chapter 27, verse 1 to 3, it says this. This is David speaking now. This isn't Elisha. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When the wicked advanced against me to devour me, it is my enemies and my foes who will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident." King David sees a God who surrounds to protect. So does Moses. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 20. I'm just pointing these out so that we know that we're together in this. This is not just one guy's thing going on here. In Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 3 to 4, Moses is speaking to his people. And this is what God had said. He shall say, "Hear, Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not panic or be terrified by them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory." They're able to see a God who surrounds to protect. Do you have the spiritual sight to see that? Often we look around, and I'm with you. We look around and we think, I can't see chariots and horses. I can't see this. Hey, why can't I see this? Is it even real? I can't see. There might be two reasons for this. The first reason is this: God's angels might be on stealth mode. That's what J.D. Greer says from the Summit Church. The angels might be on stealth mode. Because God, he still needs to accomplish something here. He still needs to accomplish his will and his purposes and his plan. So the angels might need to be on stealth mode. Now, where is all this happening? What was the name of the city? Dothan. Do you know what other really key biblical event from the Old Testament happened in Dothan? Dothan is where Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery. It was in Dothan that his brothers grabbed him and thought they were going to kill him, and they thought, well, maybe not, so throw him in a hole. So they threw him in a pit. And in that pit, I'm sure Joseph was praying for deliverance. And guess what happened to Joseph? He got pulled out of the pit and sold as a slave. He goes to Egypt. He's the slave in a household of a guy named Potiphar. Potiphar's wife accuses him of some sexual harassment that's not even true, and he gets thrown into jail for that. And then in jail, he sits and rots. People have forgotten about him. Hey, that's what happened to Joseph. But then God changed that. He remembered Joseph. And Joseph was pulled from jail. He served others. He eventually became the second in command. And so during a time of famine, when everyone's going to die, it was Joseph that God used to not just save Egypt and to have a good plan for Egypt, but to prepare a place for God's people to come and survive. That's what God had to do. And so, were there chariots of fire and horses? Sure they were. But they were on stealth mode. Because God still needs to accomplish his purpose. We might not see it because of that. And we might not see it because of this. This is not a physical battle. It's a spiritual battle. It's a spiritual battle. Ephesians 6:12 tells us that. It says, "For our battle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against rulers and authorities and the powers of darkness and the rulers in the heavenly realms, the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Okay, this is a spiritual battle we're in. And the spiritual battle is for what? For us to see who God is. Okay, that's the spiritual battle. And so 2 Corinthians 4:4 tells us that the God of this age has blinded the mind of unbelievers so that they cannot see. And it says they cannot see the light of the gospel, that good news, that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. The fight is to see. And when we can't see, the only weapon we have is to what? Pray. So we pray. Ephesians 6:18 says, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions, with all kinds of requests and prayers. And keep this in mind. Be alert. Now that's the word for guard. And always pray. And that's what Elisha did. In verse 17, and Elisha prayed. And note what his prayer is. Open his eyes, Lord, that he may see. He doesn't pray for courage. He doesn't pray for this man's heart to be calmed. Doesn't pray for peace in his life. He doesn't even pray for his fear to go away. All he prays is, God, open his eyes so he can see. Spiritual blindness believes the battle is hopeless, giving us unnecessary fear. But spiritual sight opens our eyes to the God who surrounds to protect. Fight to see the God who fights for us. Fight to see the God who fights for you. And so stand your guard and drop to your knees and pray. And there's a third section here. Verse 18 down to verse 20. As the enemy came down toward him, Elisha, here is praying again to the Lord. Okay. And what does he pray? Strike this army with blindness. So he struck them with blindness as Elisha had asked. Elisha told them, this is not the road, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you are looking for. And he led them to Samaria. After they entered the city, Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men so they can see. Then the Lord opened their eyes, and they looked, and they were there, inside Samaria. Spiritual blindness is seen in who this time? The captive soldiers. The captive soldiers. Now, interesting note here. The blindness that they're struck with is not physical. Their vision is fogged mentally, meaning they think they know where they're going, but they don't. Look at verse 19. Okay, Elisha tells them, this is not the road, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will lead you. Okay, so they have physical sight. They can see where they're going. Mentally, they think they know where they're going, but they don't. So what's the spiritual blindness? The blindness believes that the battle is under their control. Spiritual blindness believes the battle is under your control. And it's not. This is not how things are going down right now. Okay, things are going to end very differently than what they think. Believing the battle is under their control leads to lost direction. Okay, where do they think they're going? They think they're going to Dothan to get Elisha. But in fact, Elisha is the one leading them. And they don't go to Dothan, they go to Samaria, which is the capital of their enemy. And inside Samaria, they are faced with the king of Israel, their main enemy. And what happens next? Verse 21, when the king of Israel saw them, he asked Elisha, shall I kill them, my father? Shall I kill them? Do not kill them, he answered. Would you kill those you have captured with your own sword or bow? The king of Israel has to ask whether or not he can kill them. Why is that? Because they're not his captors. They're not his capture. They are God's captives. And God has captured them. And being the captive or the captor of God, he opens their eyes to see something. Spiritual sight opens our eyes to the God of loving kindness. Look what happens to them instead of death. The second part of verse 22. Set food and water before them, so that they may eat and drink and then go back to their master. Okay. Not what we thought was going to happen. Not what they thought either. So he prepared a great feast for them. And after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. So the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory. The enemies have a meal prepared before them. And it's not just any meal. This is a peace treaty happening at this moment. In that culture, man, when you break bread with someone around the table, they are no longer your enemy. They are a brother. And so it's not just they're going to have a little snack and go home. It's like with their own blood, they've signed a peace treaty. Which is why it says, and they never raided Israel again. What did they do instead? They had a feast. They got to partake of the blessings of God. Timothy Keller, reviewing this little bit of text, says this. He says, these men thought the battle would end by capturing a man. But the battle ended when God captured them. Spiritual blindness believes that we have everything all under our control. And it gives us lost direction. But spiritual sight opens our eyes to the God of loving kindness. And when we meet him, we feast. When I was a little boy, I was trying to remember the exact age that this happened. I think I was maybe around 5 or 6. We lived in Woodstock, and my grandparents lived about a half an hour away in Brantford. And so it wasn't too much of a trip. We'd sometimes go there on Saturdays, and my cousins would come. We'd do lots of sports, and Grandma would feed us really well, so that was cool. And we went to my grandparents for a visit one morning, and my grandpa, Holken Johnson. It's a good Norwegian name. Actually, he came to Canada as Holken Johansson. We just called him the Hulk. Behind his back, you never knew that. The Hulk just woke up. He slept in. I remember looking at him and just kind of teasing him a little bit. He said, Darren, second sleep's always the best. Okay. But I was noticing that he was kind of groggy. I mean, he just woke up. The Hulk just woke up. And he's kind of going to breakfast table for his oatmeal. His eyes kind of look like they're a little bit sleepy. Okay. And I don't know if it's because we were kind of teasing him a little bit, like his grandkids. But he said, boys, to me and my brother, I got a surprise for you. It's a really cool surprise. It's on my nightstand by my bed. Okay, so me and my brother, he's probably 7, we run to my grandpa's nightstand. And we were horrified. Like things right out of a horror movie. Because on the nightstand was my grandpa's eye. We had no idea that he had a glass eye. We had no idea that he actually only had one eye. So as little kids, we were running to the nightstand thinking we were going to get candy or something. It's a good thing we saw the eyeball or the color. We might have popped it in our mouth, like a gobstopper or something. It was my grandpa's eye. And to this day, it's just horrifying me to think of that. Think of it. I'm 5 years old, and I go in there and I'm poking my grandpa's eye. It was horrifying for me. Because your eye is not supposed to be left on the nightstand. Your eye should be in your head, Grandpa. It's horrifying. It's horrifying when the eye is left on the table. And with our spiritual eyes, it's horrifying when we leave our eyes on the table. It's just as horrifying. They're not supposed to be on the table. We need them. We need our spiritual eyes so we can see. And that's a fight. We need to fight to see the God who has fought for us. And we know that's true because Jesus Christ came to fight for us. See, we might have tried to fight our way to him through good works or being a good person, believing we can somehow do enough. But the gospel very clearly teaches us that we can't fight our way to God. We can't do it. We're not that strong. We're not that big. We're not that good. And so Jesus Christ came as God to fight for us. He made sure there was a way for us to get to God. And so he died on the cross for all those sins that go to war with us. So that through faith in him, we can come to be forgiven and to know him. God has fought for us. We need to fight to see that this morning. For some of you, that's the first fight. Just to fight to see a God who has fought for you. In Colossians 2:15, he says that he made his enemy a public spectacle, triumphing over them through the cross. Which is why 1 Corinthians 15:57 says, "Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ who gave us victory." The first thing you need to do is fight to see the God who has fought for you. And if you have that faith, okay, if you have that understanding, that belief, that conviction in your heart that God has fought for you and you've come to know him, you still got to fight. You still got to fight to see. So the first thing we got to do is we got to put our guard up. We got to stand our ground. Because there's so much happening in our life that is trying to blind us from who God is. Things from the outside, like different worldviews and ethics and understandings of things and people saying things to you about your faith. All these things can bombard you. You got to get your guard up. Even things inside of us, we have to guard against. Things like self-confidence from the story, or fear, or pride. All these things are things we got to fight. And so we got to put our guard up. And the second thing we do is we got to get to our knees. And we got to pray. Because sometimes all we see around us are the things that seem impossible. The things that are just too big, too overwhelming. And we see these things and we wonder, how in the world is this going to work? All we see are these situations that seem dire, with no possible good end. So we got to pray for God just to simply to open our eyes, that we can see him. That we can see him clearly. Because he is bigger. He surrounds. He fights. And the third thing we can do to fight is open our hands and receive all that God has given us. The most important thing that those soldiers received that day was peace with God. When we open our hands, we partake of all the blessings of being in a relationship with Him. We need to fight to see the God who has fought for us. And keep fighting. Let's pray. God, today, I thank you for the things that we could understand, the things that we could look at, the things that we could read together. I thank you for the things that we could sing and celebrate. But God, today, we thank you for all those things, but our one prayer is very simple. Open our eyes so we can see you. Open our eyes so we can see you. I know some people came in today with various battles in their life, things that are happening. And maybe they could see themselves in the king of Aram, Elisha's servant, the captive soldiers, because of these various degrees of blindness. So I pray that we would put our guard up, pray, and open our hands to partake. Open our eyes, God, so we can see. Amen.